Today, I'm going to talk about protests and media framing in the 1960s and today. My research focuses on the 1960s in particular, and I begin with a debate between what was often then called integrationists versus nationalists. We had this kind of core issue of Jim Crow that was a profound limitation on Black life and the ability of Black people to achieve equality. And in an effort to try and dismantle Jim Crow, there was an active debate. So you had folks like Bayard Rustin, who was a key advisor to King, and Rustin was somebody who kind of came of age as a pacifist, was a Quaker, and had this very kind of pragmatic view of how African Americans could seek power and equality in America. And he sort of argued for what I call the median white voter theorem, the idea that basically Blacks are a statistical minority and they have to work with the majority to try and build a winning coalition, right? So he argues the future of the Negro struggle depends on whether the contradictions of this society can be resolved by a coalition of progressive forces, which become the effective political majority in the United States, right? So that's a kind of coalitional model. We also had folks like Ella Baker, who had a very bottom-up but still within the system model. She helped organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She famously said, "My theory is strong people don't need strong leaders." So very much focused on grassroots activism, but again, much more kind of within the system. Later, sort of after the mid-60s, we had people like Stokely Carmichael, again here next to King, who had his own transition, once a protege of Bayard Rustin's, later became a kind of key champion of Black power. At an influential speech at Berkeley, he said at one point, "The only time I hear people talk about nonviolence is when Black people move to defend themselves against white people. Black people have already been nonviolent too many years. After being arrested 17 times and being beaten while protesting, he had had enough." There are others like Angela Davis here, who, while a professor at UCLA, became a national figure, but before that had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, had had family friends who had been bombed, and had this sense of we need to think about the long history of violence against African Americans, and that's going to be a kind of core fuel for the kind of resistance that sometimes will escalate to violence we see in the Black community. So that debate was one kind of debate happening in the 1960s among African Americans. There's also a debate that's been happening in the political science community, much more esoteric, and I'm going to move through that quickly. But the core of it is a kind of, on one side, there's an elites dominate model, which says mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence, in one paper by Gillens and Page. And then there's work that finds for more of a kind of pluralistic, allows for more bottom-up voices to be heard. Here, someone like Teku Lee is influential. Oppositional counterpublics are critical sites for the emergence of non-elite influence on mass opinion, for example, right? So that's the political science debate. And I'm going to intervene into both of those and try to see how protests work and in the context of this conference, how, let's focus a little bit more on the role of media. So one challenge for both the elite and the pluralistic model is that if we look at this data on public opinion between 1950 and 1980 on what people think is the most important problem, what we see is there's this period where civil rights spikes massively, right? And that's happening not around an election. These dotted lines are elections. We see concern about civil rights is declining as we go into the 1964 election, right? So it's not obvious that like a presidential candidate is driving the concern for, or presidential campaign is driving concern about civil rights. Similarly, there's this period where social control, these are kind of a composite of crime and riots and juvenile delinquency, are rising in the late 60s and and staying kind of peaking in the early 70s. And there again, it's not obviously driven by the period around presidential campaigns, right? It's flat here, it's declining here. So it's not obviously an elite model, and even a pluralistic model doesn't help us understand the difference. Why is it civil rights here and protests here, right? So how do we make sense of both of those dynamics? And what I'm going to propose here is a model that says that protests are influential. We have a kind of punctuated pluralism, but that punctuated pluralism really depends on the kinds of tactics that we see protesters employ. So I'm going to move through this very quickly. The kind of key idea is that the media set agendas. They favor elite narratives, but also seek profits and dramatic stories. So protest movements, social movements can kind of use that to their advantage by staging protests to dramatize injustice in the language of the activists of that era. And that's going to seed news agendas with the concerns of the subordinate group. Strategies like nonviolent or violent disruption create what essentially become tiny morality plays that help frame media coverage, but that nonviolent and violent tactics will on average produce differential effects, right? And that's what I call agenda seeding, protesters getting their concerns into the media, but potentially the media framing them in different ways. So I'm assuming here a highly stratified democracy, and the key about democracy is that there is some kind of functioning media. There's some set of coalitions, maybe kind of a status quo coalition, and one that's more aligned with this subordinate movement. It's more egalitarian, and there are at least some persuadable members of that dominant group. And the way this works out in a kind of, we can think of essentially a 2-by-2 set of things. The subordinate group is concerned about protest activity, so it's trying to elevate their concerns in the public mind. They can engage in nonviolent resistance, such as in the 1960s, something like the March on Washington, where the state counteraction is relatively peaceful, or where, like in Selma, Alabama, where the state counteraction is quite brutal. In either case, we're going to see framing in the media for more of a rights frame, and that's going to help grow the coalition, the egalitarian coalition. Conversely, when protesters employ more aggressive or violent tactics in opposition to white supremacy, we're going to see in cases where the media is more, where the police are more restrained, coverage that focuses on the protester violence, or in cases like Watts, you're going to see media focus heavily on, even if the state engages in very aggressive violence where dozens of people are killed, it's going to essentially be a wash if there's significant protester violence too, and we're going to see a heavy focus on things like riots and disorder, and that will move media and elites and masses towards this kind of status quo or order maintenance coalition. So let me just very quickly walk through 2 examples of that. March on Washington, I just mentioned, right? That's that first case. Here's Bayard Rustin again, this kind of master organizer. 250,000 people from all over the country converge in Washington, D.C. They're celebrities. Here's James Baldwin and Marlon Brando. Within a year, we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The day of the event, the New York Times says this is the greatest redress of grievances the Capitol has ever seen. Another case is, I mentioned Watts, right? That's this case of where protesters and the state are engaging in violence. And there we have a case here. Ronald Reagan is running for governor of California against the incumbent, Pat Brown. Pat Brown is relatively popular, but he loses. One theory of why he loses is that there's this Watts uprising where there are significant incidents of arson, an estimated 3,000 incidents of arson. As I mentioned before, dozens of people killed by the National Guard and police. And the media coverage around this, the concern about this, helps propel Reagan, the Republican, who campaigns on law and order. So I'm going to try and do a more systematic analysis of that. I'm just going to spend a minute on this and just say that I look at across 3 different elections, 64, 68, 72, and 3,000 counties. I look at if a county was proximate to a protest, does its Democratic presidential vote share change? And I control for a bunch of stuff. And the basic idea is if your county was exposed to protest activity, does it vote more liberally than we'd expect or more conservatively than we'd expect? And what I find, and again, I'm going to move through this very quickly, is that counties that are proximate to nonviolent protest activity vote slightly more liberally, about 1 to 2 percentage points more for the Democratic Party. And counties that are near protests that escalate to violence, where that might be measured in number of protesters or measured in number of arrests, we see about a 1 to 6 percentage point shift away from the Democratic Party using a wide variety of specifications. So there does seem to be an effect, or at least a relationship between protests and voting behavior. And I show that it's not just at the county level, but that when we aggregate that up in an election like 1968, those couple of percentage point shifts are enough to shift states like New Jersey, Delaware, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, and that actually would have tipped the 1968 election from Nixon to Hubert Humphrey. So it matters, but almost nobody sees a protest. So how could a protest be actually having these big effects? And here is where I want to get into the part about media. So we see in these data, this is again public opinion data. Green line is percent saying civil rights is the most important problem, number of protesters per month. And what we see is there's a spike around consideration of the 1960 Civil Rights Bill. There's a big spike in right around the March on Washington. Right. And so we see public opinion is moving with protest activity declining as protest activity declines, going back up again as the bill is considered, declining again. And then Selma, Bloody Sunday, John Lewis famously has his head cracked open by state troopers. Big spike in concern, but again, declines very quickly. Right. So plausibly, protests are moving public opinion. Similarly, with violent protests, that is to say, with protester-initiated violence, we see a pattern where the public opinion on social control is kind of going up and down. And when I first looked at this, it looked almost like it was just noisy. But when I realized when I overlaid that over protest activity, what really was going on is that there's something seasonal. There's a seasonal structure to this. It's going up in the summer and down in the winter, and up in the summer and down in the winter, and up in the summer, down in the winter. And that suggests that something is not, it's not just, racism is a really important factor here, but it's not just racism. And we need something that helps explain that seasonal structure, and something like the violent protests that are occurring in this period are plausibly what's helping to move that public concern. So to try and get a little bit closer to the mechanism, I collected 275,000 front page headlines between 1960 and 1972 from a bunch of major papers in the United States, and looked for keywords like civil rights or voting rights or riots and Attica. There's a prison uprising at the Attica prison, so that's why that's there. And what we see, there are 3 measures now, so it's a lot to track. But in the purple line, what we see is that that's nonviolent protest activity. The kind of grayish blue line is headlines, and the green dashed line is public opinion. And here, as the purple line spikes right around the March on Washington for protest activity, the grayish blue line spikes in headlines, and the green line spikes in public opinion. Again, they go down together. As consideration of the bill happens, they go up together. They go down up until until Bloody Sunday, again a spike, and then it kind of tapers off, right? So plausibly, all 3 are co-varying in a very consistent way. When we look at concern about social control, again, now the purple is violent protest activity, headlines about terms like riot, and public opinion around things like social control. We see in the beginning, there does seem to be some covariance, but it's relatively small. And then they spike together in 67, decline again. Here we see protest activity, big spike in protest activity in 68, headline spike in 68. Public opinion has a big gap, and so I can't say for sure whether it's just not moving or we're just missing data. But as protest activity declines, public opinion declines, again, one more spike. And then in this later period, they kind of uncouple, and this is really, I suspect, driven by anti-war protests, and I have some evidence of that I won't get into. So to sum up the kind of statistical analysis that I also do, nonviolent protest today predicts a front page headline about civil rights. A violent protest today predicts a front page headline that mentions riot. Importantly, violent protests do not predict a headline about civil rights. Nonviolent protests do not predict a headline includes riots. Just going to move through that very quickly. And I also find that there's the protests on the ground are helping to construct media frames. So I looked at about 500 events, these protest events, collected 4,000 articles about those events, and looked at the words that are used in those articles. And what I find is that articles about events that are coded as nonviolent relative to events that are coded as violent, we see words like church, king, march, demonstration, civil rights are occurring about 2 to 3 times more on this log scale, or 1 to 2 times more on the log scale. And conversely, on the where protesters are violent relative to protesters being nonviolent, we see words like shot, fire, riot, store, right? So we're seeing much more use of words that are kind of that would construct a frame in your mind if you were reading this that suggests violence as opposed to kind of a redress of grievances, right? Playing to a crime script, not a rights script. And if we look at a little more qualitatively, even a sort of seemingly neutral term like store is occurring about half the time in events that are coded as nonviolent. Store is the object of a boycott, a sit-in, or a lunch counter protest. For events that are coded as including protester violence, store is co-occurring about 3/4 of the time with the word riot and about half of the time with the word loot, right? So very different kinds of qualitative ways in which these terms are applying. So now let's conclude by thinking about what's happening today. And I do see similarities. So in the 60s, there was a pro-segregation media and a national white media that was largely indifferent to the concerns of African Americans, and that's why protests were so important. And we see evidence of a kind of, again, fragmented media, right? So there's a car that drove into protesters. Here CBS News says the driver of a white Prius runs into protesters in Hollywood, striking some of them before being stopped. Washington Times, a more conservative newspaper, writes Black Lives Matter crowd swarms LA driver, attempts to extract during, quote, peaceful protest, right? So we're still seeing echoes of that fragmented media in the past, though today even more fragmented. We do see echoes of the kind of bias for the dominant group. This is Kyle Rittenhouse, who is accused of shooting 2 protesters. And here the New York Post, again, a more conservative media, reflecting, sort of presenting the good guy Kyle Rittenhouse, right? So some evidence of a kind of similar to the past bias in the media. Also, bias for authorities. This article highlighted looters swiped 2.4 million worth of watches from Soho Rolex store. In that same article, though, it says the store spokesman said no watches of any kind were stolen. So, the police, the official narrative can sometimes trump what's happening on the ground. We see, images of fire, very powerful. That's something that was true then, is true now. Framing, still very much a factor. So here, Reno residents to join in nationwide protest against the death of George Floyd is one headline. Same event, Wasow County DA files felony charges against 4 suspects in connection with Reno riot. And then just very quickly, this is data from 538. We see Black Lives Matter protests, kind of spiked and fell in coverage or before the Trump administration, but now in 2020, big spike again in coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's clearly about protests making the news. But there still are these kind of framing effects, particularly by channel here. So this is coverage of protests in the beginning. All of them are using the word protests. Fox is using the word looters, looting a lot more, and riot and rioters a lot more, right? So they're different frames, and that's going to matter politically. But we do see media being attentive to issues of state violence. This is a piece in the New York Times that did a really good job of talking about police tactics. Washington Post talked about how all of the social media videos capturing alleged violence by police was really helping to sort of change coverage and the public perceptions. Perhaps most famously, an old 75-year-old man in Buffalo was knocked over. A lot of attention to these sort of the potentially unjust use of force by the state. So in conclusion, we see evidence that protests can influence media. It's not just elites, and that the protests can draw attention to injustices. And I also find evidence that they're shifting not just media, but public opinion, elite discourse, and voting. But tactics matter, and the kinds of things that protesters do really through the media can grow or shrink the egalitarian coalition. Political violence may induce gains from elites, but it's often going to be counterproductive in electoral politics, where you have to worry about the mass response. So ultimately, elites dominate political communication, but hold no monopoly. Thank you very much.